In the sweltering heat of the Louisiana summer of 1833, whispers crept through the cane fields, whispers of a woman who spoke to shadows and called out names no living soul should have known. Plantation workers claimed she predicted deaths before they happened, that she stood under the moonlight and muttered to voices no one else could hear. They said her tongue carried the language of the dead, and her prophecies came true every single time. What began as fearful superstition soon became a tale of terror that haunted Louisiana for generations. Louisiana in 1833 was a place where the air itself seemed to hum with secrets. The swamps were thick with mist, the nights heavy with the scent of decay, and beneath the pines and cypress trees, whispers passed like the wind. It was a land born of contradiction, Catholic prayers rising over the same fields where old African chants were murmured under the moonlight. The people who worked the plantations lived in a world where faith and fear were two faces of the same spirit, where unseen forces were believed to move through the air, through dreams, through illness, through the cries of birds at night. It was in this fragile balance between the holy and the unholy that the story of Madeline began, a story that would stain the memory of Louisiana like a curse that refused to die. She was not born into legend, she was born into labor, one of the countless souls who lived and died in the shadow of the cane fields. But something about her, even from childhood, unsettled those around her. Her mother said that when she cried, the lamps would flicker, and when she laughed, animals would grow silent. She had a way of staring too long at people, her eyes soft and still as though she were listening to something only she could hear. Some of the elders whispered that she had been touched by spirits before she could walk, that something had chosen her before she ever had the chance to choose for herself. As Madeline grew, the strange quiet that followed her began to draw notice. She spoke little, but when she did, her words carried weight. Her voice was low and steady, often echoing things that others had only thought. It was not unusual, they said, for her to speak someone's name just as that person was about to enter the room or to finish a sentence another had barely begun. The overseers dismissed it as coincidence at first, but the other slaves avoided her, muttering that her spirit walked too close to the edge of the living world. They said she had the mark of the two worlds upon her, that she saw the line between life and death the way most people saw the horizon. In Louisiana during that time, the veil between superstition and faith was thin. The plantation owners spoke of God and judgment, while those who worked beneath them spoke of spirits and shadows, of ancestors who still lingered in the earth. Crosses hung from necks, but so did charms made of bones and beads. People prayed in churches on Sundays and whispered incantations under the trees on moonless nights. It was not disbelief that haunted the people, it was belief itself, deep and wild and uncontained. So when strange things began to happen around Madeline, the community did not question whether they were real. They only wondered what kind of spirit she had awakened. It began with small things, a child's toy that went missing only to be found days later where no one had searched, a mirror that cracked without cause, the sudden death of a field worker who had argued with her the night before. Rumors grew as fast as the sugarcane, rumors that Madeline could hear the whispers of the dead, that she could see spirits standing among the living. Some said she walked in her sleep, barefoot in the mud, her lips moving as though in prayer, her eyes open but unseeing. Others swore they saw her speaking to figures that vanished when approached. Her presence became a shadow over the plantation, and people began to avoid her, crossing themselves when she passed. The masters of the plantation, steeped in their own arrogance and religion, dismissed these stories as ignorance. But even they began to notice that Madeline's presence brought unease. Animals grew restless around her. The dogs refused to enter her cabin. The air in her corner of the quarters seemed colder, heavier, and yet, despite their fear, they did not send her away. Perhaps they were curious, or perhaps some small, cruel part of them enjoyed the dread she inspired. She continued to work quietly, her expression blank, her eyes distant, as though she was always half in another world. Then came the fever. A sickness swept through the fields, striking both the enslaved and the free. Madeline fell ill like so many others, her body burning, her breath shallow. For 3 days she lay still, caught between life and death, while her fellow slaves whispered outside her door, afraid to enter. They said her skin grew cold as marble, her lips blue, but her heart refused to stop. On the 3rd night, just before dawn, she awoke. Her eyes opened, but they were not the same. They seemed older, darker, filled with something that did not belong to the world of the living. She spoke, but her voice had changed too. It was slower, deeper, carrying a strange rhythm, like a song half remembered from another life. From that day forward, nothing was the same. She began to speak names, quietly at first, almost absently, the names of people who were alive and well, people who laughed, ate, and worked beside her. But soon after she spoke each name, that person would fall ill, suffer an accident, or simply not wake up one morning. At first, no one believed it was her doing. But the pattern was too precise, too impossible to ignore. One by one, the names she spoke became tombstones, and fear took root in every heart that heard her voice. The plantation became divided between those who thought she was cursed and those who thought she was chosen. Some said she was a prophet, sent to warn the living of death's approach. Others called her a witch, a vessel for demons. Even those who believed in her gift did not dare approach her. The sound of her voice became unbearable, her silence even worse. She no longer smiled, no longer spoke unless she had to. Her eyes, always distant, seemed fixed on something far beyond the reach of mortal sight. It was as if her soul had stepped out of her body and left only a vessel behind, a vessel that carried the weight of every name she spoke, every life she foresaw slipping away, and every shadow that lingered just beyond the edge of the firelight. When the fever finally released its grip on Madeline, she was no longer the same woman who had fallen sick days before. The others said she came back hollow-eyed, her voice rasping as if she had swallowed smoke, her skin pale beneath the torchlight. She walked with the slow, uncertain steps of someone learning to move in a body that no longer belonged entirely to her. Those who tended to her swore that during her fever she had muttered names in her sleep, names of people who were still alive, names that rolled from her lips in strange tones like prayers spoken backward. When she awoke, she could barely speak for hours, her throat raw, but when she finally found her voice again, it was steady, calm, and terrifyingly sure. She looked around the small cabin and said the first name aloud, not with fear or confusion, but as if she had simply remembered something long forgotten. The others who heard her froze. That man she named, strong and healthy that morning, was dead before the next night. The news spread fast. The slaves whispered it from one end of the quarters to the other, voices trembling as though even speaking of her might draw death closer. The overseer dismissed it as superstition until Madeline did it again. This time, it was one of the field hands who had mocked her recovery, calling her a devil's child. Madeline's eyes followed him for a long moment as he passed, and then she whispered his name under her breath. Within 2 days, his body was found face down in the cane fields, the sun already blackening his skin. By the third time, no one doubted. When Madeline spoke a name, it meant death had already begun its slow walk toward that soul. Madeline herself seemed unaware of what she was doing at first. She would stop working suddenly, her hands frozen mid-motion, her eyes distant, like she was listening to something just beyond hearing. Her lips would move, and a single name would come out, soft but certain, carrying through the heavy air like a curse. Each time she would shudder afterward, her breathing uneven, her expression vacant. The others began to avoid her, stepping off paths to keep their distance. Mothers pulled their children away when she passed, clutching them close as if her shadow could cling to them. The masters began to take notice when her words reached their ears. To them, such things were dangerous. Fear among the workers was bad for control, and whispers of witchcraft threatened the fragile order they clung to. One of the overseers dragged her to the big house to face the master himself, a man named Colonel Hensley, who believed himself God's chosen hand in a land he ruled by cruelty. He demanded she speak to tell him what kind of devil she served. Madeline said nothing for a long time, her eyes fixed on the floor, her silence more unnerving than defiance. When he shouted again, she finally lifted her head and spoke. Her words were calm, her tone flat, and she said his name. The overseer struck her for her insolence, but the master went pale. 3 nights later, Colonel Hensley was found dead in his bed, his eyes wide open, a look of horror frozen on his face. After that, they could not touch her. The remaining masters tried to pretend she was nothing but a coincidence, but deep down, they were afraid. No one wanted to be near her. No one wanted to hear her speak. They moved her to a small cabin at the far edge of the fields, away from the others. Her meals were left at her door, Her water was fetched by trembling hands that dared not look inside. Yet even in her isolation, her words carried. The slaves said the wind itself seemed to listen to her now. They claimed her whispers rode on the night breeze, finding the ears of those whose time had come. Madeline began to change in other ways too. Her sleep was restless. People who dared to watch her from a distance said they saw her rise at strange hours, standing barefoot in the dirt, staring into the darkness as if waiting for someone. She murmured softly to the air, speaking in a language no one recognized. Some said it was Old African, others said it was the tongue of the dead. Whatever it was, it made the dogs howl and the trees sway as though stirred by unseen hands. When the morning came, she would return to her cabin and sit silently until dusk. Her eyes fixed on nothing, her lips trembling with words she seemed to hold back. There was something deeply unsettling about the way she spoke the names. It wasn't loud, it wasn't theatrical, it was almost gentle, as though she pitied those she named. And each time she did, it was followed by silence. The kind of silence that seemed to seep into the soil, the kind that made people hold their breath, waiting for the inevitable. Those who lived closest to her swore they could feel the chill before she spoke. The air would grow heavy, the birds would go quiet, and the sound of her voice would come like the crack of a whip. Some began to believe that she wasn't the cause of death, only the messenger of it, that she didn't bring death but merely saw it coming. Others thought she was marked by something evil, something that used her mouth to speak its will. There were those who wanted to kill her, to end the terror that gripped them all, but none dared. The memory of the master's death was too fresh, too certain. No one wanted to risk being the next name to fall from her lips. Priests were brought in once, men from the nearest parish who came armed with crucifixes and holy water. They entered her cabin at dusk, praying in Latin, their voices firm at first, but trembling as the minutes passed. They said the air grew suffocating inside, thick and foul, and that the candles burned with blue flames. When they emerged, their faces were ashen, their eyes downcast. They refused to speak of what they saw, but none ever returned. From that night on, the locals said the ground around her cabin never dried, that it remained damp even in the height of summer, as if the soil itself wept. As the months passed, Madeline became quieter still. She rarely spoke unless compelled, and when she did, it was always the same, the name of someone whose life was about to end. Her voice had become the sound of doom itself, and her silence, a mercy. The slaves began to say that she no longer belonged to the living. They said that when she looked at someone, it was not their face she saw, but their death. They said her eyes no longer saw the world as it was, only the shadow of what was coming. And so she moved through the plantation like a ghost who still drew breath, her footsteps soft, her presence colder than the wind that blew through the cypress trees, and her whisper, the quiet promise that no one wanted to hear. The more Madeline spoke, the deeper the fear around her grew. Every whisper of her voice sent ripples through the quarters. Every name she uttered carved another wound into the fragile sanity of the plantation. The masters had stopped pretending it was coincidence. The deaths followed her words too perfectly, too consistently, like echoes that would not die. The overseers avoided her eyes now, and even the cruelest among them, the ones who took pleasure in the whip, would fall silent when she appeared. There was something in her gaze that made men falter, something that spoke of knowledge no human should bear. She had become an unholy fixture, a shadow that lingered even when the sun was high, and everyone who saw her knew instinctively that she belonged more to the world beneath than to the one above. Her chains came soon after the priest's visit. The masters could not bear the thought of her free among the workers, yet they feared to kill her outright. So they decided to confine her, to strip her of freedom, hoping to quiet whatever spirit possessed her. They dragged her from her cabin one night, iron cuffs biting into her wrists and ankles, locking her in the old storage shed behind the stables where the air was thick with dust and the smell of decay. The men who chained her said she did not resist. She walked quietly, her steps slow and measured, her eyes fixed on the ground. One of them later confessed that when he clasped the shackle around her wrist, he felt her pulse beating strong and steady, but he could swear it wasn't in rhythm with his own heartbeat, as though her blood moved to some strange, separate rhythm. The first few nights she was kept in the shed, they heard her murmuring. Not loud enough to understand, just the faint sound of her voice rolling in steady waves, soft and rhythmic, like a song meant for no living ears. The overseers posted to watch her began to change. They complained of hearing voices when they were alone, of footsteps following them through the dark, of seeing shapes at the edge of the cane fields that vanished when approached. One man swore he heard her speaking his name one night, though when he rushed to the shed she was silent, staring at him through the slats with that same empty calm. By morning, the man had vanished. His footprints led halfway down the path to the river before disappearing into the mud. They never found his body. The masters tried punishment next. They starved her, denied her water, beat her with whips until the flesh on her back ran red. She made no sound, no cry of pain, only looked up at them with that strange stillness, as if she pitied them for what they were doing. When they struck her again, she whispered one of their names, and within days that man was dead, his body found hanging in the barn, eyes bulging, a look of pure terror frozen on his face. After that, no one laid a hand on her again. The marks on her body healed, but her silence remained. The overseers began to cross themselves when passing her shed, and even the slaves who hated her feared to pity her. She had become something other, something untouchable, her suffering swallowed by whatever unseen force had claimed her. There were nights when strange lights flickered around her prison, soft blue glows that shimmered like distant lanterns, yet vanished when approached. Those who dared to look through the gaps in the wood swore they saw her sitting motionless, eyes closed, hands resting on her knees, her lips moving in steady rhythm. It was as if she was speaking to someone unseen, her words weaving through the still air like threads of smoke. One woman claimed she heard multiple voices answering her, whispering from the darkness, their tones hollow and distant. The woman was found days later wandering near the swamps, her mind shattered, unable to speak more than a few broken phrases. The master's wife, a woman of sharp faith and fading sanity, decided that Madeline was possessed and needed salvation. She ordered another priest, this one from New Orleans, to perform an exorcism. He arrived with candles, incense, and a crucifix so large it cast a long shadow across the room. He entered the shed at dawn, his prayers loud and defiant. For hours, his voice filled the air, rising and falling like waves of desperation. Then the voices began to answer him. Witnesses said it wasn't Madeline's voice at all that spoke, but dozens, layered upon one another, some whispering, others laughing, some crying out in languages no one could recognize. The priest staggered from the shed, pale and shaking, his robes torn, his cross bent out of shape. He refused to speak of what happened, only muttering that there were too many souls trapped in one body. He left the plantation before nightfall and was never seen again. From then on, they left her alone. The masters pretended she didn't exist, as if ignoring her could erase the evil they believed she carried. Yet her influence seeped into everything. Workers refused to go near her shed after dark. Even in daylight, the area around it felt strange, cold, heavy, muffled. The air carried no birdsong there. The ground beneath her window grew barren, as if nothing could take root where she had been confined. Some of the slaves began to leave small offerings at the door, bits of food, flowers, or coins, hoping to appease whatever lingered inside her. They said if she was fed, she might stay silent, that if she was honored, her whispers would pass them by. But sometimes, late at night, her voice still drifted across the fields. It came low and slow, a haunting melody that carried on the wind, speaking names again, always names. The plantation would hold its breath, waiting to see who would fall next, and each time she spoke, the pattern continued. The sickness, the accident, the sudden death with no explanation. Even the strongest men grew gaunt with fear, sleeping in shifts, praying their names would never pass her lips. Children cried when they heard her voice, and mothers held them tighter, whispering prayers to saints and spirits alike. Madeline remained in that shed, bound and alone, her hair turning white, her skin thin as paper, yet her eyes never dimmed. There was a quiet intensity in her gaze that unsettled anyone who met it, as though she still saw beyond the veil that separated life from death. Some swore that her body no longer cast a shadow, that when the sunlight fell upon her, it passed through her like mist. She was no longer seen as a woman, but as a living boundary between two worlds, a reminder that death was always near, always listening, always ready to claim another name whispered by her haunted tongue. By the time news of Madeline's strange power reached the towns beyond the plantation, her story had already begun to twist into legend. Travelers who passed through the bayous spoke of her as though she were a ghost still walking among the living, a woman half devoured by the dead. Her name became a warning murmured in taverns and churches alike, a tale that set children trembling and drew uneasy glances between grown men. They said there was a cursed woman deep in the Louisiana countryside who could speak a person's name and summon death itself to their doorstep. It didn't matter whether one believed it or not. The fear it inspired was enough to make even skeptics fall silent when the wind carried her name through the moss-covered trees. The plantation where Madeline lived grew quieter with each passing season. The workers moved slower, as though time itself had thickened around them. The laughter that once echoed faintly from the quarters vanished, replaced by an anxious silence that hung over every meal, every prayer, every darkening sky. The overseers no longer shouted. Even their cruelty seemed dulled by dread. It was said that when someone fell ill, no one dared to speak their name aloud, afraid that it might draw Madeline's attention. Her power had become so feared that her silence was treated like mercy, her voice like the final toll of a bell. The world outside began to take notice. Merchants and priests, curious men with polished boots and hollow courage, rode out to see the cursed woman for themselves. They found the plantation shrouded in stillness, the air thick as smoke. Some claimed the birds avoided flying overhead, that even insects refused to crawl near her prison. They said her presence warped the land around her, as though the soil itself recoiled from what it held. When the visitors tried to question her, she did not answer. She would only look at them with eyes that seemed to reflect more than they revealed, eyes that made grown men stammer and leave before nightfall. Her story began to evolve in retellings. Some said she was not born human, but the child of a drowned witch, left on the doorstep of the plantation as an infant. Others claimed she had made a pact with a spirit in the swamp, trading her soul for power after years of cruelty and pain. There were whispers that she had been a healer before the fever took her, that she had tried to save lives and that her curse was the punishment for reaching too far into forbidden knowledge. No matter which version was told, the ending was always the same. Madeline spoke, and death followed. The townspeople began to mark her influence in the strangest ways. When a storm rolled through and lightning struck too close to a home, they said it was because someone there had angered Madeline. When the church bell rang without cause, they whispered that she had spoken again. Children born sickly were said to have been cursed by her glance, and every sudden death was tied somehow to the rhythm of her whispers. Louisiana, already steeped in superstition and sorrow, found new life in her legend. Her story became a living thing, passed from mouth to mouth, growing darker each time it was told. Back on the plantation, time did not touch her the way it did others. The seasons changed, the fields grew and withered, but Madeline remained the same. Thin, quiet, motionless, except for the faint rise and fall of her chest. It was said that she no longer slept, that she simply sat and listened to the voices that only she could hear. Sometimes her lips moved, forming words no one could understand. Those who dared approach her said they could feel something in the air around her, a low vibration, as if the earth beneath her pulsed with hidden energy. There was no doubt among the people that she was a conduit between the world of the living and the world of the dead. When the masters died one by one, their deaths slow and inexplicable, no one doubted the cause. Their children fled the land, leaving the plantation to rot. The house that had once been bright with music and arrogance became a tomb, its windows shattered, its walls heavy with silence. Madeline's cabin, or what had been her prison, remained untouched. No one dared enter it, though strange lights were seen flickering within on moonless nights. Sometimes a voice, low and mournful, drifted across the fields, carrying words that seemed to blend with the rustle of the cane. As decades passed, her story bled into folklore. People began to visit the old plantation, bringing offerings, coins, food, or candles to leave at the edge of the ruins. They said it was a way to keep her spirit at peace, to ensure she would not speak their names in her endless watch beyond the grave. Some claimed they saw her walking the fields under the moonlight, her white dress glimmering faintly, her hair blowing though there was no wind. Others said she stood by the river, her reflection shifting between the face of a woman and the hollow outline of something not entirely human. Those who lived nearby swore that the land never truly recovered. Crops refused to grow near her resting place. The trees bent unnaturally, their roots twisting toward the cabin as though drawn to something within. Travelers who camped too close often woke to find their fires extinguished, their horses restless, their breath fogging in the humid air. There were even tales of people hearing their own names whispered from the darkness, spoken softly, almost tenderly, before vanishing into silence. The locals came to believe that Madeline was neither good nor evil. She was something older, something beyond the reach of prayers and punishments. She had become a spirit of balance, a keeper of death's rhythm. Some said she spoke the names of those whose time had come to spare them pain. Others said she summoned death simply because she could not stop it. Whatever truth remained was buried with her, if indeed she was ever buried at all. Her name lingered through generations, a warning carried through time. Parents told their children never to wander too far into the fields at night, never to call out into the dark, and never to ignore the sound of a woman whispering their name. The line between myth and memory blurred until the people could no longer tell which was real. Madeline became part of the soil, part of the air, a ghost that never rested, her story woven into the very bones of Louisiana's haunted history. And though the years turned to decades, and the plantation sank slowly into ruin, there were still those who swore that when the air grew still and the night fell heavy, they could hear her voice again, carried on the wind from the depths of the bayou, whispering softly, endlessly, the names of the dead. As the years dragged on, Madeline's life began to fade into something that no longer belonged entirely to the living. Her body grew frail, her movements slower, her skin taking on the ashen hue of one who had spent too long between worlds. Yet even as her strength dwindled, her presence did not weaken. The slaves said the air itself seemed to thicken around her cabin, as though time held its breath in her company. There were nights when strange sounds echoed through the plantation, the faint rustle of chains dragging across the floorboards, the low murmur of many voices overlapping like wind passing through reeds. No one dared to investigate. It was said that if you looked too long into Madeline's eyes, you could see your own death reflected there, waiting, patient, inevitable. In her final days, she hardly ate, and no one saw her drink. Her lips were always dry, but they still moved at night, whispering to shadows that pressed against the walls like restless specters. The slaves, worn down by years of fear, began to wonder if she had become something beyond human entirely. The overseers refused to approach her hut, leaving her untouched and unspoken to, as if she had ceased to exist altogether. Yet the strange occurrences did not stop. Chickens were found dead, with no wounds upon them, mirrors shattered without reason, and the bell from the main house would sometimes toll in the middle of the night, echoing across the fields, even though no hand touched its rope. They said the bell was her signal, that each toll marked another soul she had whispered into the beyond. On the night she died, a storm broke over the Louisiana lowlands, fierce and sudden. The sky churned, black and bruised, lightning splitting the horizon while thunder rolled like 1,000 footsteps through the heavens. The slaves huddled together in their quarters, clutching their children, praying aloud, though none dared to say her name. They said the storm came for her, that the heavens themselves had opened to claim her spirit. Those who lived nearest to her cabin swore they saw flashes of blue light inside, not fire, but something colder, something that pulsed like a heartbeat. Between each thunderclap, her voice could be heard, low, rhythmic, chanting the way she had when the fever first took her. Some said she was speaking to the dead again. Others said she was naming those who would soon follow her. When morning came, the storm had vanished, leaving the world eerily still. The ground around her cabin was soaked, but the air carried no scent of rain. The door hung slightly open, creaking softly in the breeze. Those who gathered there hesitated to enter. It was one of the older women who finally stepped inside, crossing herself again and again as she did. What she saw was enough to silence her for the rest of her life. Madeline sat slumped against the wall, her eyes wide open, her face calm, her mouth slightly parted as though she had been caught mid-whisper. Her body was cold, her skin grey, but it was not death that froze the onlookers, it was what was behind her. The walls were covered in marks, dozens of them, carved deep into the wood with something sharp. They were names. Every name belonged to someone on the plantation. Some had already died, others were still alive. But 3 names stood out, freshly carved, marked with smears of dried blood. Those 3 people would be found dead before dawn broke the next day. From that moment on, no one touched her body. The masters were gone, the priests refused to come, and the slaves would not bury her. They sealed her cabin instead, nailing the door shut and crossing it with salt and ash, whispering prayers older than the church itself. They said she should not be disturbed, that her body might still be listening, that her soul had work yet to finish. In time, the cabin began to sink into the swampy ground, half swallowed by mud and moss, until it seemed the land itself wanted to keep her hidden. But people still claimed that on certain nights, when the air was heavy and the moon pale, the faint sound of her voice could be heard from within, whispering the same endless litany of names. Years turned into decades and the plantation decayed. The main house collapsed under vines, the fields turned wild, but Madeline's cabin endured. Travelers stumbled upon it from time to time, drawn by curiosity or misfortune. They would find it half buried, the wood blackened by age, but the carvings inside remained untouched. Some said they could still feel warmth radiating from the walls, as though the names themselves pulsed faintly under their fingers. A few who dared to enter claimed they heard breathing, faint but steady, and one man swore he heard his own name whispered as he fled. He was found drowned in the bayou 3 days later. As her story spread, the boundaries between truth and myth dissolved completely. Some said she had never died, that she lingered as a spirit trapped between 2 worlds. Others believed she had become one of the lower, a spirit of death and prophecy, who wandered the swamps in search of the unburied and forgotten. Locals began to leave offerings near the ruins, bottles of rum, candles, bits of jewelry, tokens meant to keep her appeased. They believed that as long as she was remembered, her whispers would remain merciful. But when her name was forgotten, when people stopped speaking of her, she would rise again, her voice drifting through the cane fields, naming those who had lost their reverence for the dead. Children grew up with warnings passed down through generations. They were told never to wander into the swamp after dark, never to speak their full name aloud where the wind could carry it, and never to ignore a woman's whisper calling from the trees. It was said that if you turned when you heard it, you would see her standing there, thin and pale, her eyes endless black, her mouth moving with your name spilling softly from it. Some said she came as a warning, others that she came to claim. And sometimes, after a death in the village, old women would murmur that Madeline had spoken again, her prophecy carried through the night to balance the living with the dead. The legend became Louisiana's inheritance, a haunting memory that refused to fade with time. Even in the modern age, when machines carved roads through the wilderness and the old plantations were swallowed by the march of years, the story of Madeline endured. Her name was still spoken in low tones, her tale still told beside the firelight when storms rolled through the bayou. There were those who said that the air grew colder near her resting place, that the mist thickened as if aware of her presence. They said the dead still listened when her story was told, that the sound of her name alone was enough to stir the silence of the grave. And so the legend lived on, not in the pages of history, but in the trembling voices of those who dared to remember the slave who once spoke the names of the dead, and whose whispers never truly left the darkened soil of Louisiana.